Property, slavery, the law, and the commodification of Black women's womb. First, I'm going to talk about the definition. What makes a slave a slave? And like I said, I'm focusing on the New World variant of slavery, which, uh, was also a very racialized system, meaning, by the time we get to the end of the 16th century, it was mainly confined to Africans or to Black people. Scholars on this subject have identified four features that legally defined slave status. First, the enslaved was chattel or property. They could be bought, sold, traded, bequeathed, and even destroyed by their owners or enslavers. Secondly, slavery was permanent. It lasted a lifetime unless there was an interruption like manumission, marriage, or abolition. Third, it was hereditary. This inherited status passed from mother to children through the principle of partus sequitur ventrem, and most of my talk will be on this principle. Partus was tied to the womb of Black enslaved women. Finally, as mentioned earlier in New World slavery, there was a racial component. Slavery was racialized within the New World, and as meaning it was confined to the body of Black people. And as slavery matured, it became tied to and associated with Black people. So we could define slavery as a system of human bondage and power relations in which one group of persons, enslavers or slaveholders, legally and politically exercised ownership and thus property rights over another group of persons, the enslaved. The slave is a possession of the owner, and it's important to bear that in mind. The ownership is maintained and exercised through violence, covert or overt. The enslaved is chattel, but sometimes paradoxically, as in the court of law, for example, the enslaved is seen as human. If they commit a crime, suddenly they're no longer a piece of property. They're a human and they must be made accountable for that crime. The labor of the enslaved is coerced into the production of activity that directly benefit the slaveholder. Now we come to laws. Europeans turned to the law to support the enslavement of Black people and codified anti-Black racism. Within New World variant of slavery, it was Europeans, white people by and large, who were the enslavers, who set up these slavery regimes, these slavery empires throughout the Americas. Slave laws would be enacted to discipline the body of the enslaved and to regulate the institution of slavery with brutal efficiency. These legislations included the Barbados Slave Code, the Virginia Slave Code, the Siete Partidas of the Spanish Empire, and the notorious Code Noir of the French Empire. In 1627, Barbados became the first New World colony for England, and it codified slavery in 1661. It doesn't mean that slavery wasn't practiced before 1661. In fact, in Barbados and other colonies, they were engaging in the practice of enslavement through the use of customary law. So they said, slavery is legal. England recognizes slavery. We can enslave people who are not Christians. In fact, in the early colonies, this was kind of a pivot on which the whole thing spun. Non-Christians, we can be enslaved. And they were doing that in Barbados. They made a distinction between Christians and non-Christians. Non-Christians were barbarians, were Africans, and so on, and they could be enslaved. So, but they codified made these laws in 1661. Statutory laws was written down. By 1661, England had acquired colonies in Maryland, the Carolinas, Virginia, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Kitts, and Montserrat. These colonies created their own slave codes by using the Barbados Code as a template. English property law was also intrinsic to the formation of English colonial codes that centered slavery. And these laws validated the ownership of enslaved Blacks by defining them as chattel. Later, British Canada would draw on the slave codes of the New World colonies, American slave laws, and New France legal code, French Canada, to regulate the practice of enslavement of Black people within its borders. These laws defined and circumscribed the lives of enslaved people from the moment of conception to the time of their death. Africans as possessions lay at the heart of Black enslavement in Canada. Africans as possessions. This fundamental denial of Black humanity was intrinsic to the formation of white supremacy and anti-Black racism during slavery. Now, here's this the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, which made slavery heritable. And these laws that came out of the partus principle were used to regulate Black people's reproduction. So nowhere is the issue of slaves as property more fully demonstrated than in the area of Black women's fertility and reproduction. And here's the Virginia Slave Code, passage from it, of 1662. All children born in this country shall be born or free, or bond or free, rather, according to the condition of the mother. An enslaved woman who gave birth did not own her children. They belonged to her owner. Many enslaved women of childbearing age were purchased for that reason, to have children for their owners. The womb of the Black woman in slavery was purely seen in economic terms by those who oppressed them. And what the partus principle did was basically to reproduce the labor force for free and turn enslaved woman's womb into a baby-making machine for slavery's capitalism. And I'm going to read more on the Virginia Slave Code, which was enacted in 1662. Virginia is important. The Royal Barbados is important because these were two of the earlier English colonies. And it was in these colonies were like the, in terms of the slave laws and statutes, were like matrices for ideas around how slavery would be rolled out in these colonies. Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of the mother. Virginia Slave Code of 1662, Article 12. Whereas some doubts have arisen, and I'm quoting directly from the document, have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free. Be it therefore enacted and declared by the present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be bond or free according to the condition of the mother, and that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay the double fines imposed by the former act. And so one of America's first slave laws concerned the status of children born to slave mothers and white men, actually, and we'll get more into that. Thus, at the very foundation of English colonial rule in North America and colonization, we find one of the first laws was about using the Black women's womb to reproduce slavery. We come to the Code Noir, which was promulgated in 1675 from Versailles, from Paris, for the overseas French colonies. The children who will be born of marriage between slaves will be slaves and will belong to the master of the women slaves. So, you know, in indentureship, children born of indentured laborers are not going to be indentured laborers. They're going to be, you know, free. Children born of slaves will be slaves. And if there's any confusion, then the status of the child will follow the status of the mother. The Partus principle bolstered white supremacy and reproduced Black servility and inferiority and turned the gender order upside down. What do I mean by that? In English property law, or in English law in general, children followed the status of, or children inherited the status of their fathers. Patriarchy, we all, most people have their father's last name, right? Your social status derives from that of your father. Under enslavement, these English men and Frenchmen and whomever turned that law upside down and made it so that children now are going to follow the status of their mothers. And so, therefore, the paternity is not important at all. The father could be a white man, could be indigenous, could be a black man, could be slave, could be free, did not matter. As long as the woman was a slave and she's pregnant and gives birth, the children are going to be slaves. So what these English laws did and other laws was to turn this idea of children following their father's status upside down. In fact, the whole thing about children are now going to gain their mother's status in enslavement again came out of English property law, but it pertained to animals because there was a dispute. Let's say if a cow or a horse or some other beast of burden or animal farm got pregnant, and some other farmer might be claiming it because he said my bull impregnated that cow, and so English property law made it no, the calf that the cow or the horse will give birth to belongs to the owner of the cow or the horse or the. So it came out of animal laws, which is interesting, because for me it shows how the English laws, English lawmakers link Black women's body to that of the animal body. Here we have, I'm going to give a Canadian example of this Partus principle. In 1805, in St. John, New Brunswick, one lawyer by the name of Samuel Dennis Street applied for a writ of habeas corpus to produce the body of a boy by the name of Richard Hopefield Jr. Richard Hopefield was a young enslaved boy whose mother, Stacy, had arrived in the colony with her loyalist master from New York. After the American Revolution ended in 1783, white loyalists took their black enslaved people, fled from the new United States to the British territories in what is now Canada. There were also free black loyalists, but in this case, Stacy was enslaved and she arrived in New Brunswick with her loyalist master. Once in New Brunswick, she was sold 3 times and ended up with a slaveholder by the name of Phineas Lovett. While she was with Lovett, Stacy married a free black man named Richard Hopefield. But in marriage, her troubles continued. In late 1784, Stacy got pregnant, and her owner decided to confine her to a ship with the intention of sending her to the West Indies. So lots of names here. Her owner is Phineas Lovett. He is in St. John, New Brunswick. Stacy marries a free black man by the name of Richard Hopefield. She gets pregnant by Richard Hopefield. Her owner now seizes her, confines her to a ship that is bound for the West Indies. Her husband, Stacy's husband, hurried to the governor of the colony, Thomas Carleton, and told him of the situation. Carleton ordered Stacy to be removed from the confines of the ship and freed, and to live quietly and undisturbed in the enjoyment of liberty. 8 years later, so she's living in the enjoyment of liberty from 1784, and then in 1792, one of Stacy's previous owners, a man by the name of Dr. Clark, showed up. He said she's his property. He sees, he seizes her and he re-enslaves her. And 2 years later, sold her to another man by the name of Joseph Hewlett. So Stacy's now sold like 5 or 6 times. By now, she has the baby. The baby's growing up. Um, And somehow, even after she was sold to Joseph Hewlett, she now ends up with another slaveholder to whom she sold by the name of Steers Agnew. And he now possesses her son. Remember the child she was pregnant with. Agnew came to possess Stacy's son. How he came to possess the child is not clear, but he's indicated in documents for a cruel treatment and abuse of two Negro boys, his slaves. And one of these boys was the baby who is now grown up. And his name is Richard Hopefield Jr. He has his father's name. He's junior. The father is senior. Then the father, because he's free and because he has some resources, he sues Steer Agnew for a beating of his son and for false imprisonment under slavery. So it goes to court, and the judges decide. They said, well, Richard Hopefield is free, but the kid's mother, Stacy, is unfree, and therefore the child should go back to Steers Agnew because Steers Agnew owns the child's mother. And the Crown said that even though Richard Hopefield, the father, is free, is a free man, he was never legally married to the mother, so that the child now has taken the status of his mother rather than that of his father. The court found in favor of the slaveholder, and the boy was returned to him as his slave. The fact that the court ignored the free status of Richard Sr. in favor of the slave status of Stacy had its support in common law pertaining to slavery, the partus principle that I am talking about, which says that children inherited the social status of their mother. This image on your screen is an illustration of a girl, she's 15 at the time, by the name of Diana Bastien, and we will come to her later. Diana Bastien is from Cape Breton, New Brunswick. I commissioned this illustration. It was done by an artist by the name of Comey Olaf. And I've put it there because it's, pregnancy. It speaks to pregnancy under enslavement. And Diana Bastien was raped and made pregnant, but we will come to her story. Here's an American example of this principle. The case of American fugitive slave abolitionist Henry Bibb also graphically illustrates how Black children in slavery took the status of their mothers. In September 1812, a slaveholder by the name of Robert Hunter of Henry County, Kentucky, sold his 17-year-old slave girl, Millie, to a man named William Butler. But it was not only Millie that was sold to Butler. It was all her unborn children. And it gives you chills when you read these documents. Yes? Because here is what the deed drawn up in Henry County, Kentucky states. Sold unto the said William, one female slave by the name of Millie, of the age of 17 years, the rights of the said slave and her future increase. So this thing of future increase, when you buy a woman slave, a female child slave, you're also buying her womb. You're buying her future increase. Thus, Millie, her womb, and all the children that would issue from it were sold to Hunter by Butler. It seems that Millie was pregnant at the time of her sale and purchase, because 2 years later, now in the household of the man to whom is sold, we find her with an infant child named Henry, and he grows up to be the famous Henry Bibb, the famous lecturer and abolitionist who came to Canada and founded Canada's first black newspaper, The Voice of the Fugitive. So 2 years later, here's this baby that Millie has. And guess what? His father is white. Didn't matter. Didn't matter. It didn't matter because the baby is now owned by Millie's owner. Thus, one of the pernicious ironies of slavery is that enslaved women, through their reproduction, perpetuated a system that oppressed and victimized them. Dorothy Roberts, legal scholar, has done a lot of work on this, and she notes that in slavery, Black women bore children who belonged to the slaveholder right from the moment of their conception. It's beyond pernicious. Black people have been enslaved in Canada for over 200 years under both the colonial and French and English regimes. And then the English regimes became a British regime because, 1707, the Britain, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland joined together to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Under enslavement, Black women did not own or control their reproductive capacities. As is known, whatever children they bore belonged to their owners, as in the case of Millie and others tell us. I will now deal with two insidious examples um, under the French and English colonial regimes, respectively. And in July 1784, Jean-Pierre Roman, who was a commandant for the king, this is still during the French period, we could say he was like the governor of Ile Saint-Jean, which is present-day Prince Edward Island. And Jean-Pierre Roma travels from Prince Edward Island to Quebec City with a young baby. Baby is described as a 5-month-old mulatto child named Marie. And he gave the baby to his friend Fleury de la Gorgendiere. The mother of the child, whose name wasn't given in the documents, was a slave of Roma, and she died in childbirth. So Roma now has this baby, the mother is dead, he travels to Quebec City by ship, and he's giving the baby to his friend as a gift. And the question we're asking ourselves, well, the mother of the dead mother was a child of Roma. Who is the father of this child? The documents describe the child as a mulatto. We know the woman, the mother, was a quote unquote pure African, coming from in the area of Benin. So was Roma the child, the father's child? And so he could now take this child because he owns the child and gives the child as a gift to his friend because maybe he's thinking the mother is dead. I have no one to raise a child. Let's give the child to my friend and his wife in Quebec City who could raise a child as their possession. A second example is that of Diana Bastien. In the burial record of St. John's Anglican Church in Sydney, Cape Breton, is an insert 15 September 1792. I'm going to find it, and it's at the bottom because there's something I want to do with that. So here is the document transcribed. St. George's Anglican Church, Sydney, Cape Breton, which reveals a very sad and tragic fact. 15-year-old enslaved girl, Diana Bastien, belonging to Abraham Kyler, died giving birth to twins. One of the twins died during the childbirthing process, the other survived. The record states that Bastien was seduced and ruined by one George Moore, Esquire, a naval officer and one of Governor McCormick's council. So Cape Breton was its own colony at the time, and George Moore was one of the members of council. He was 48 years old. Tyler, the owner of Bastien, was a prominent loyalist born in a Dutch New York family, a one-time mayor of of the city of Albany, who fled Albany and New York during the Revolutionary War. He migrated to Cape Breton via Montreal, and in Cape Breton became an influential man and member of council. He brought Diana with him, Diana Bastien, to Cape Breton. When they arrived, she was 7 years old, so she grew up in Cape Breton. Her owner was a member of council. The man who raped her, George Moore, was a member of council. In fact, he raped her at Government House. That Diana Bastien was impregnated by a much older man and then abandoned points to the vulnerable and precarious position of enslaved Black women who, by virtue of their status, had no rights or honor and was unworthy of masculine protection. Diana Bastien went to the Justice of Peace in Sydney, Cape Breton. And she most earnestly, as this document states, implored the favor of Mr. Moore's brother. Mr. Moore was the man who raped her. His brother was a Justice of Peace in Sydney, Cape Breton. So she went to his brother to ask for help, saying, Mr. Moore, your brother impregnated me. I need help concerning my pregnancy. But the brother refused her every assistance. She might have harbored the vain hope that Moore would acknowledge her and their offspring. But according to the document, and I just said it so I won't say it again, she was refused every assistance from Moore. Diana Bastien's enslaved people, like Diana Bastien, let me read that again. Diana Bastien was an example of an enslaved woman who had her sexuality coerced by those like Moore who sought to exploit it and then ostracized her. Her story illuminates the textured history of enslaved Black Canadian women and further how race, gender, and slave status intertwined to give meaning to Black women's lives on the Canadian colonial frontier. So Komi Olaf, the artist, he made this drawing, and Diana Bastien is in the foreground, the Justice of the Peace, who represents George Moore's brother. He's there with his pen, basically ignoring her, rejecting her, sending her away from his office. I'm going to go back to the whole issue of the law. So enslaved people as property was recognized in many colonial statutes during the French regime. I won't go into that so much unless people ask me questions. But here at the Conquest of Canada, in the 47th Article of Capitulation, we find slavery recognized by the British and really giving the French the solace that they can continue to own enslaved people. They shall be at liberty to keep them in their service in the colony or sell them. And they may also continue to bring them up in the Roman religion. So at the time of conquest, both sides, the conquered and the conqueror, acknowledged slavery. Of course, by this time, Britain, 1760, was the largest slaveholding power. During the 18th century, Britain imported close to 4 million captive Africans into new world colonies. So Britannia was ruling the waves. Britannia was also ruling the slave trade, and they had the resources to bring even more enslaved people into Canada. 1781, we find this is interesting because people saying, well, Prince Edward, it's a small island. Why would they have, passed a slave act? All blacks or mulatto servant who are in this island as slaves, um, they will continue in bondage. And this Slave Act also has another piece attached to it that even if you convert to Christianity, you will continue in bondage as slavery. In early English law or in the English period, not just English, but European as a whole, there was a period, say maybe up to 1630, where English, European colonists and colonizers were grappling with the idea of can Christians enslave other Christians? And so they said, well, Africans are barbarians, so they perfect to enslave them. And so as many people were converting to Christianity, um, and so enslavers were now, and colonizers were in this quandary. These people are Christians. Can we really enslave them? So they began passing acts saying, yeah, even if you convert, you'll still be enslaved. And the Partus Act principle that I've been talking about, it was also to subvert that practice of people converting to Christianity and therefore feeling that they're eligible for freedom. Because Partus is saying, no, you're going to get your status through your mother. Even if your mother is a Christian, forget it. In 1781, so Prince Edward Island, for some reason, which you can talk about, decided to pass this act. It didn't mean that slavery wasn't there before. Slavery was there before. They were going by customs and traditions that they inherited from Britain and from old New France. 1790, this act was passed in the British Imperial Parliament to encourage more English speakers to come into Canada. 1790, the place we call Canada, Central Canada, was still largely speaking a French-speaking area in terms of colonization. So they wanted to overwhelm the French with English speakers, so they passed this Imperial Act, immigration into British North America, Bahamas, Bermuda, permitting the free importation of all Negroes, household furniture, utensils of husbandry or clothing. So you see how Negroes, meaning enslaved people, are kind of peered or are in the same category as different forms of objects or property. You may have heard of the 1793 Act to prevent the introduction of slaves to Upper Canada. It did not abolish slavery. It did not one enslaved people got free from this act by Simcoe Pass in Upper Canada, 1793. It banned the importation of new enslaved people to the province of Upper Canada, but it reaffirmed the legality of slavery within Upper Canada, and it invoked the free womb law, meaning that it says, yes, slave children can become free at the age of 25. So, but it was a gradual kind of abolition. So this is 1793. If you add 25 years to it, say a kid is born in 1793, 25 years later, they're eligible for freedom. So Simcoe's law really did not abolish at all slavery in Upper Canada or free one slaves. Now, this is also another important document, a petition of the Annapolis Valley slaveholders. Annapolis Valley is in Nova Scotia. And what was happening in the Annapolis Valley and other areas in Nova Scotia is that people began running away from slavery. So there's a woman by the name of Rachel Fair, Fair. She fled the Annapolis Valley region into Halifax. And while in Halifax, began working. Her owner got wind of where she was, and he left the valley and came to Halifax and sought to seize her again. It went to court, and the judge ruled in her favor. So Rachel Fair was freed. Other enslaved people running away and claiming their freedom. So the slaveholders of the Annapolis Valley, they got together and they petitioned the local legislature, and they said, we want specific ruling on enslavement. We want to be confident, we want to be supported that we are in our right to own slaves. And it's interesting because, they're saying, Negroes are property. Um, they got that pedigree from their African slave ancestors. Negroes universally through the colony are like chattel, sometimes by bill of sale, sometimes by mere possession. This is in 1807, by the way. And they're making their case, you know. And they said, well, it's legal because the Parliament of Great Britain authorized it. And the Parliament of the United Kingdoms thus still allow it. So this is how many of the Canadian colonies, they may not necessarily have to enact a law pertaining to slavery or legalizing slavery. They could just look to mother country, Great Britain, and said the Parliament has authorized this. And we as British subjects, we are entitled to own Black bodies. 1752, this is an importation ad that was placed in a colonial newspaper. 1752 by a slave trading colonizer by the name of Joshua Major. He was also a businessman, and he was very much involved in the West India trade, where colonial merchants, white merchants up in Canada, sent salted fish, salted beef, salted pork, flour, horses, etc., to the slave colonies of the West Indies and the Greater Caribbean. And in return, they would import the sugar, the rum, the molasses. And not only did many private families earn their fortune or gained family fortunes through the West India trade, but the West India trade was also very important for gaining taxes. And these taxes were put in colonial legislature in the pots in that colonial, the governors and whomever the government used for infrastructure building to pay colonial officials who were on the civil list to build schools, houses, hospitals, universities. For example, Dalhousie University was, its first endowment came from taxes that were placed upon products, slave-grown products coming from the West Indies. So you may never have to see a Black West Indian slave to enjoy the fruits of her labor. So Joshua Major he's importing all these people from the West Indies very early from into Halifax Harbor, where it says just imported and to be sold at Major Lookman's store in Halifax. We talk about the property principle. Here are two slaves to be sold, 1760, a boy and a girl, likewise a puncheon of choice cherry brandy and sundry other items. So, the human property is just placed among the inanimate property. Peggy Pompadour, she was in York, which is Toronto. And in 1806, her owner, Peter Russell, who was a former colonial administrator, one of the elites of Upper Canada, placed an ad in the newspaper attempting to sell her. She's about 40 years. Her son named Jupiter, he also wants to sell Jupiter. Both of them the property of the subscriber, the property principle. Right? The woman is a tolerable cook and washerwoman and perfectly understands making soap and candles. The boy is tall and strong for his age and has been employed in the country business meaning on a farm. He's been employed on a farm, but brought up principally as a house servant. They're each of them servants for life. That was another euphemism that colonial whites started using as people started challenging slavery. They didn't want to use the word slave anymore. They said property for life. So, Marie-Joseph Angelique herself, this is a book that I wrote, was accused of setting the fire in Montreal in 1734 that burned half of the city. She herself suffered the pangs of, Black womanhood and Black motherhood in slavery. She had 3 children. She was impregnated 3 times. 2 times the record said, well, father unknown. And usually when you see that after the child's name, father unknown, it's typically a white man who is the father of the child and usually the owner of the woman. Slavery was an unjust, horrifying, and terrifying system that dehumanized Black people. Out of it arose a pernicious white supremacist culture, and within that matrix, we find roots of anti Black racism. Today, we are still grappling with the legacies of this death dealing system, the death dealing system that was slavery. It robbed Black women, men, and children and their families from raising their babies in comfort, free from the master's whip and receipt books hanging over their heads. For enslaved women and mothers, for some enslaved women and mothers, this was too much to bear, and they took action. They engaged in acts of resistance. They ran away from bondage. They took their owners to court and sued for their freedom. They committed infanticide and abortions. They joined maroon communities. They sometimes murdered their enslavers. Here is, I want to bring your attention to this situation. Ran away from the subscriber, the following bound Negro slaves, namely Isaac, about 30 years old, born on Long Island near New York. It describes what he had when he went away or ran away. Flora, a wench about 27 years old, much pitied with the smallpox. Also Nancy, about 24 years old, who took with her a Negro child about 4 years old called Lidge. The 4 mentioned Negroes were born in Maryland and lately brought to this country, put there by their slave owner Caleb Jones, 1786. This is Fredericton, New Brunswick. I included this slide because 14 years later, we're going to have Nancy, same Nancy, who ran away with her child, Lidge, suing Caleb Jones for her freedom. She said Caleb Jones has wrongfully imprisoned her and kept her as a slave. So she sued him. The case went all the way to the New Brunswick Supreme Court, but she lost and was returned to Caleb Jones as his slave property. But the fact that this woman had the audacity to sue her owner, for me, was just extraordinary. Marie-Joseph Angelique herself engaged in various acts of defiance in Montreal. We believe she set 2 fires that burned that city. Margaret Garner of Kentucky fled slavery with her 4 children, and as the slave catchers surrounded her, she took out a knife and began killing her children. And it's from this story that Toni Morrison wrote the book Beloved. Toni Morrison used the Garner story too. And Beloved is the child in Morrison's book that was actually killed because Margaret Garner was able to successfully slit the throat of one of the children. And Toni Morrison is imagining, well, what happened to that child? The child became a ghost and began to haunt her mother. It's quite chilling. But this did happen. In fact, when Margaret Garner, that situation, they began calling her Medea, Medea of the Greek, a legend. Bette of Quebec City fled in the middle of winter, highly pregnant. And this one is very sad because run away from the subscribers, a Negro wench named Bette, about 18 years old, middle stature, speaks English, French, and German languages well, describes what she had on when she went away. Whoever will apprehend said negress and secure her return shall be paid a reward of $20. Um, Look, it says in the ad that she was big with child and within a few days of her time. So what would impel her to run away? 6 March, it's still winter, there's still snow on the ground, to run away within 5 days of her going into labor. But she did. She ran away. And just to let you know, she was caught. When they caught her, the baby was given birth to, but the baby was dead. And she was tried for infanticide, but because they didn't have enough proof, she was released. But this is just another sad story of Black women um, in bondage, Black women and their children, and how Black women's womb was perverted during the enslavement period. I talked about Nancy, who took her owners to court, her owner, rather, Caleb Jones. Chloe Cooley fled from slavery in the Niagara Peninsula in 1793, and that's because of that situation. Simcoe was able to pass that act in Parliament, the one we talked about. Chloe Cooley not only fled from her enslaver, but she fought them when they captured her and tried to confine her. And in Toronto, Peggy Pompadour fled from slavery several times. How do we correct this wrong of slavery? How do we correct it? The legacies of which confront us every single day. Well, I'm proposing that reparations is one of the ways to do so. I'm also proposing that we continue further research on this topic, on women, slavery, and the law, on the Partos principle in Canada and the rest of the Americas. Let us continue the work. Thank you.